In the still of early morning, as the first light softened the edges of dawn, a salt merchant from a distant town arrived at the wooden bridge over the small stream. The bridge was old and narrow, its planks worn by generations of feet. The stream beneath bubbled gently, its surface dotted with leaves cast off by the night's cool breeze. The merchant, an older man who moved with quiet grace despite his age, had been walking for hours along winding paths that led from the market to this remote corner. He stopped at the midpoint of the bridge and watched the water flow beneath him, the ripples dancing in the light. Nearby, a young woman sat on a boulder by the stream's edge, her hands cradling an infant who cried softly but without urgency. Her face was marked with lines that told stories of hard work and quiet endurance. The baby stirred as the merchant approached, looking up at him with wide eyes that reflected nothing but pure wonder. The man nodded to the woman, offering a small smile, then continued across the bridge. Halfway through his crossing, however, he paused again and turned back toward her. From within his coat, he withdrew 2 packets of salt, one for himself and another wrapped carefully in cloth. He stepped off the bridge and walked over to where the woman sat. She looked up at him expectantly but did not rise. With a practiced movement, she adjusted the baby against her shoulder as if readying herself for any exchange that might come. The merchant placed the packet of salt beside her on the rock and said, "For you and your little one." He spoke softly, his voice carrying no sense of obligation or pity. "Thank you," the woman replied simply. There was a warmth in her tone, acknowledging without exaggeration the small act of kindness. He nodded once more before turning to leave, but paused again briefly as he took several steps away from them. The woman watched him go, wondering perhaps if there would be any more words exchanged. Instead, she saw that he had stopped under a nearby tree where its branches offered some shelter against the growing sun's glare. He pulled off his coat and draped it over himself like a cloak, then leaned back against the trunk of the tree. She returned her gaze to her baby, who was now quiet, content in her mother's arms. The woman gently hummed an old lullaby as she looked at the man beneath the tree's shade. Her eyes softened as she considered him sitting there, taking a moment for rest and peace before continuing his journey. The merchant stayed under the tree for some time, occasionally glancing back toward the stream where the woman and her child had become a quiet figure in the morning light. His movements were slow and deliberate, marked by a sense of ease that seemed to flow from him like water running over smooth stones. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, casting longer shadows across the path and bridge below, the merchant finally stood up and folded his coat back around himself. He began walking again, this time in the direction opposite where he had come. The woman watched until she could no longer see him moving beyond the bend in the road. She returned to her task of soothing her baby with a gentle hum that filled the air around them. As they sat together at the edge of the stream, their presence became as much a part of the landscape as any leaf floating on its surface or stone resting along its bank.
You're listening to the Empty Teahouse. Sun's golden promise stretched across the river as dawn bled into day. A village tea house, half empty at dusk, its floorboards creaking underfoot, steam thick with jasmine tea.
At dusk, the village tea house was half empty, its wooden floorboards creaking underfoot. The air inside was thick with steam and the scent of jasmine tea. Outside, a light drizzle had begun to fall, muting the sounds of the day's bustle. A woman named May sat by herself at a small table near the door, her fingers idly stirring her nearly empty cup of tea. She had been there for hours, watching people come and go, lost in thought. Across from her, a girl around 12 years old entered, her steps slow and deliberate, carrying an oversized woven basket filled with vegetables. "Good evening," May said softly when the girl set down her load beside her own empty chair. The child looked up, startled by the interruption of her thoughts. "Hello," Her voice was quiet, but there was a gentle curiosity in her eyes. I see you've brought home quite a harvest today. Yes, my family sells at the market. We try to gather as much as we can while it's still warm, she replied with a slight smile, setting down a bag of flour and eggs beside her basket. You must be tired, May observed, noticing the girl's posture begin to droop slightly under the weight. I am a little, she admitted, glancing around the tea house before meeting May's gaze again. Would you like something from my basket? Perhaps just one of those tomatoes? May asked, pointing at the basket where several ripe red fruits were peeking out from beneath green leaves. The girl hesitated for only a moment before reaching in and pulling out 2 plump tomatoes instead, setting them down on the table. I can share these, she said, her smile growing slightly wider as she watched May cut 1 tomato into thin slices and sprinkle salt over them. Do you have anyone to talk with about your day? May asked as she ate a piece of tomato slice. I usually just tell my dog when I get home, the girl responded without missing a beat. He's always waiting for me. He must be a good friend, May remarked, savoring another bite thoughtfully. Yes. The girl paused and then said, Do you have anyone special in your life? May smiled, but her eyes softened at the question. I used to, she murmured, setting down her slice of tomato without eating it further. The two sat quietly for a while, the steam from May's tea mixing with raindrops dripping steadily from the girl's hair and clothes. Outside, the lights in the tea house flickered as the last few patrons prepared to leave. I should probably head home, the girl said eventually, gathering up her basket and bags. Thank you for sharing your tomatoes. May stood as well, moving towards the counter where she would pay for her tea and perhaps a snack on the way out. The girl started walking towards the door but turned back briefly at May's table. It was nice meeting you, she said with sincerity before leaving in the gentle patter of raindrops against stone paths outside. May watched her go, her gaze lingering on the empty space where the basket had been a moment ago, now filled only by shadows from the lowering sun. She took one last sip of tea and placed some coins for payment next to an overturned cup that had held more than just steamed leaves.
A lantern flame steadies in the drizzle of evening. Winter settles over a city, still and cold, steam from noodle bowls rising gently against chill air.
The winter evening had settled over the city in a thick blanket of stillness. At a small noodle stall on a side street, steam rose gently from the bowls and swirled into the cold air. The light inside flickered as if it too felt the chill, casting shadows that danced across rough wooden counters. Outside, an old woman stood hunched over beside the narrow alleyway leading to the back of the shop, where pots clinked softly behind a curtain of steam. A young man, no older than 25 with tired eyes and calloused hands from years of labor, wiped his face with the sleeve of his worn jacket. He stepped out of the stall door carrying 2 steaming bowls and held them carefully as he approached her. She looked up at him with watery eyes, not speaking but acknowledging him with a small nod. He set the bowls down on the ground beside her before crouching to be level with her. There was no need for words, she knew why they were there. The woman unwrapped the lid from one bowl and let out a breath of steam that swirled around her face. She spooned some noodles into her mouth slowly, savoring the warmth against her lips. The man watched quietly until he saw her eyes close in relief. He leaned back slightly to give her space, his presence enough company. They sat like this for what felt like a long time, just breathing and eating in the peace of their shared silence. When she finished, she placed her empty bowl on top of his full one and patted him gently on the arm. He nodded in understanding and returned to the stall to take orders from others waiting inside. As he went back into the warmth of the shop, the old woman reached out towards the alley behind her, feeling for a discarded newspaper bundle that she often found there. She opened it to find an old scarf wrapped tightly within, something someone had left or thrown away but could still serve its purpose in the cold. She wound it around her neck twice and looked up again at the stall door where light spilled out from under the edge.
The man emerged once more, this time carrying 2 small wooden boxes wrapped in newspaper tied with twine.
He sat down beside her again without a word and placed the boxes between them. One held fresh pastries still warm from the oven, the other was empty but lined carefully with greaseproof paper as if it had been prepared for something. She smiled at him gratefully, knowing that he understood she would take one of each to share with someone else less fortunate than herself. She unwrapped a pastry and broke off a piece, holding it out towards him. He shook his head slightly but took the offered bite without hesitation. Then he slipped the empty box into her hands along with a few coins from the day's earnings. She tucked both away carefully in her newspaper bundle before standing up shakily on wobbly knees. She turned to leave, moving slowly down the alleyway, her back hunched but straightened slightly under the weight of the pastries and coins. The young man watched as she disappeared into the darkness, only his breath visible against the cold air now that the steam from their food had dissipated. He went back inside to continue serving others, feeling lighter somehow, though he didn't know why. When the last customer left and it was time to close for the night, he gathered up some more newspapers and a small pot of leftover broth before stepping out into the dark once again. His hands fumbled in the darkness until they found the edge of her alleyway. He set down his offerings quietly by the side where she would find them easily enough when morning came. Then, he turned back towards home himself, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air around him as he walked alone under the moonlight.
The stall's shadows fade as night falls, silent but for footsteps. Dawn breaks in a temple courtyard, children darting among stone statues by an old well.
Under the dawn sky of a temple courtyard, barefoot children darted among ancient stone statues as their mothers gathered water from an old well. A young woman knelt beside a basin filled with clear water, her hands submerged up to the wrists, fingers spread wide over each surface. She wore simple clothes, a pale shift stained at the hem and sleeves by dried clay. Beside her stood another woman, older, her hair tied back in a neat bun that shone with traces of silver. The younger woman scrubbed methodically, then paused as she felt eyes upon her. The elder had joined silently, leaning against an old stone pillar, watching quietly as the dawn light painted shadows across the courtyard's worn stones and ancient pillars. "Do you come here every morning?" the younger asked without looking up, a question prompted by habit rather than curiosity. "Yes," the older woman said softly. "It calms me." The younger woman nodded but didn't look up from her task of cleaning her hands. She rinsed once more before drying them on a nearby cloth, then turned to face the elder. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, offering her hand for support as she rose from her kneeling position. The older woman took it gently, and they walked together toward the temple's kitchen where a fire burned steadily under a pot of water. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of burning wood and fresh bread baking in a small oven. They settled at a long table cluttered with morning dishes and half-eaten breakfasts left by departing pilgrims. The younger woman busied herself pouring steaming cups from a large teapot, while the elder found 2 wooden bowls on a shelf. "Your hands are always full of clay," remarked the older woman, watching as the younger one set down their tea carefully. "It's part of the job," she said with a small smile, "but sometimes I need to wash it off." They sipped in silence for a moment, allowing the quiet to settle between them. The courtyard beyond was still mostly empty, save for the birds beginning their day and the distant sound of children laughing at play. "I heard you're planning to leave soon," said the older woman quietly, looking down into her cup as if tracing ripples there. The younger one's hands paused around her teacup, her fingers tightening briefly on its edge. She nodded without speaking, understanding that this conversation didn't require words. After a few more moments of sipping tea and letting morning seep in through the doorways and windows, they finished their cups together. The elder placed hers back onto the table gently, as if saying farewell to an old friend. "I'll miss you," she said simply when the younger woman stood up first, collecting bowls from both places. The younger one smiled warmly, but didn't respond immediately. She picked up the older woman's bowl and held it out with a quiet gesture of gratitude before walking her back toward the courtyard door. They stepped outside into soft morning light that seemed to soften even the most rugged edges of stone and earth around them. Without another word, she bowed slightly in farewell as the elder turned to walk away down the path leading deeper into the woods beyond the temple walls. The younger woman watched until the older woman disappeared among the trees before turning back toward her workroom, where more pots waited patiently for hands that never truly washed clean of clay, but only briefly paused from their shaping and forming. As she walked, a small sparrow fluttered down to land on her shoulder, chirping softly. She reached up to touch its delicate feathers gently before it took flight again into the clear blue sky.
A leaf drifts softly to the path under the early morning sky. In a quiet alley between clay walls, dawn paints shadows blue and gray.
In the quiet alley between two clay walls, dawn painted shadows with soft blue and gray. Old Mrs. Lou sat on her doorstep, her back straight as she braided strands of lavender into a thick rope for sachets. A small sound behind her made her pause, the clip-clop of wooden clogs against worn stones. Little Lynn stopped before her door, clutching an oversized basket that rested too low on her slender frame.
"Good morning, Mrs. Lou," said Lynn, voice breathless but respectful.
Mrs. Lou nodded without looking up from her work. She knew why Lynn was there. Twice a week, the child carried fresh vegetables and fruit from the market for old Zhao's herbal shop down the alley. Today, the basket overflowed with red apples and golden pears.
"Is Master Zhao ready for his morning tea?"
Lynn asked quietly. "He is," Mrs. Lou replied, her hands moving steadily through the braiding process.
"Set it here beside me."
Lynn placed the basket on the ground and took a step back. She watched Mrs. Lou's fingers dance deftly with each strand of fragrant lavender. The woman spoke without looking up. "Master Zhao hasn't been feeling well lately." "I heard," Lynn said, eyes tracing shadows as they lightened with the sun.
"Do you remember when he used to teach Tai Chi in the courtyard?"
Mrs. Lou asked suddenly. "Yes, I do." A smile touched her lips.
"You and your friends would gather there every morning.
I never understood a word, but it felt like magic." Mrs. Lou chuckled softly. "We thought we were teaching others how to find balance and peace." Lynn glanced at the herbs around them, bundles of dried mint hanging overhead, jars filled with roots and seeds on shelves. Her eyes traced lines along the rough wooden walls. She wondered if Mrs. Lou had ever felt a moment like this, sitting here years ago as someone else brought her tea or food.
"Is there anything I can do?"
Lynn asked quietly. Mrs. Lou paused in her work, looking up at the child. "You are already helping greatly," she said simply.
Lynn nodded, unsure what more to say.
She stared at her hands, remembering when they had been small and clumsy. Now, carrying the heavy basket seemed like a feat of strength and endurance. "I have something for you," Mrs. Lou continued, reaching into a drawer beside her. From it, she pulled out an old wooden comb and handed it over to Lynn. Lynn took the comb gently, tracing its worn edges with thumb and forefinger. "Thank you," she said softly. Mrs. Lou returned to braiding lavender. The quiet filled the air between them, not uncomfortable but warm and accepting. For a moment, Mrs. Lou thought back to all those years of practice in the courtyard. She wondered what it meant now that no one gathered there anymore. Lynn looked down at the basket, then back up at Mrs. Lou's calm face. "I'll go tell Master Zhao his tea is ready," she said quietly. Mrs. Lou nodded, her fingers never stopping their work. Lynn turned and stepped out of the alley into early morning light, leaving behind only the soft clip-clop of wooden clogs fading away.
The clip-clop of wooden clogs fades into the distant hum of morning. Shadows grow longer as the day unfolds. the tea house closes for the night. Until tomorrow.